Shall we? Good morning. Actually, we're probably good afternoon. This is special for me that I get to speak about Abouna Bishoy Kamel in the chapel of Abouna Bishoy Kamel around the feast of Abouna Bishoy Kamel. He is one of my favorite saints, and I'm calling this the living gospel. I actually had a picture in my room where someone painted a face of him, and underneath it says the living gospel. That's how he's known as, someone who lived the gospel, the walking, living gospel, which I think is a model for every Christian on how to be Christ-like, his life. In his funeral, Pope Shenouda said, "We didn't lose a servant, we lost a school." He was a school on service. He wasn't just, but his life was something to be studied. And I think every Coptic servant should study his life if you want to be a servant. So this book really had an impact on me. I found it in 1991 in a very small monastery off of the Nile when we went to Egypt. It had like 4 monks and 8 books in the library, and one of them was in English. And God wanted me to have this book, but this idea, it's called magnetic radiation. The idea that his life was very magnetic. When I read it, it had a huge impact on me, and I hope other people would be able to get to read this book as well. I was drawn to him, but also how Christ was in him, and how Christ was being manifest in him. And when you see someone where Christ is actively present in them and working through them, that's so appealing. That should be the goal of every servant and actually every Christian, because we are supposed to be Christ-like. Now, my 3 favorite models for service, for those of you who know me, Jesus Christ, of course, has to be number 1. He says, "I came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many." And probably my favorite topic is St. Paul, the bondservant of Christ, and my third favorite topic is probably Abouna Bishoy Kamel. But the thing that they had in common, for me, if you were to ask me the greatest servants, these are my 3 greatest servants. There was one common theme in their lives and in their service. The cross was the exact center of who they were. And from the cross flowed an endless amount of love. And I think the most appealing things about their lives, where do we get 1 Corinthians 13 from? St. Paul. Where did we learn everything about love? From Jesus Christ? And Abouna Bishoy Kamel just exuded that love in his life. So, I have some books that he wrote. The magnetic radiation one, I have a PDF if anyone wants it. And there's a book that he wrote, it's actually in our bookstore, it's called The Cross of Ministry. It's not called the Comfort Tempur-Medic Mattress Ministry, it's called The Cross of Ministry, because ministry is a cross. And the cross was a very central part of Abouna Bishoy Kamel's life if you read any of his writings, and we'll talk about that a little bit. But he says the foundation of pastoral ministry, it has to begin at the cross. Otherwise, it will culminate in failure. The cross embodies boundless love. I had to give a talk on St. Paul last week. I was privileged to give the talk on St. Paul last week, and I was reading 2 Corinthians. So many of the verses that St. Paul was writing, I felt like could be exemplified in Abouna Bishoy Kamel's life. St. Paul says, "The love of Christ compels me, and we judge thus, if one died, he died for all, and if he died for all, we should live no longer for ourselves, but for him who died and rose again." So for St. Paul, he says, Christ's love on the cross compelled me so much that the life I should live, I'm not going to live for me, I'm going to live for him. For St. Paul, the cross was central to his writings and to his motivation for why he did what he did. And same thing with Abouna Bishoy Kamel. He recommends that everyone have a picture of the cross in your room. And he prayed before this picture. He had a very simple cross, picture of a cross, and at the bottom of it, there was 2 words in Arabic. Min ajli. It's for my sake. If you read any of his books, my Holy Week book is usually the sayings of Abouna Bishoy Kamel during Holy Week on the cross. For him, his embracement and adoration and admiration for the cross was the motivation for his service. Once you see how much Christ has done for us, you're like, how could I do anything less? And so I think it's critical that servants do have an appreciation for the cross. He describes the priest and the servant as a martyr for love of the church. He says it's toil, sweat, labor, and suffering. If you are enjoying your service too much, there's a problem. There needs to be a lot of toil and suffering. This is the same idea of the second mile service. But again, in Matthew 11:39, Christ says, "He who loses his life for my sake will find it." That's kind of what service is. You're losing yourself for the gospel's sake, for the spreading of the gospel. And Abouna said, the toil, sweat, labor, and suffering. Then he said, follow each along the second mile. You guys know the concept of the second mile service? Abouna Bishoy Kamel wrote a book on the second mile. In the days of the Romans, you guys know where the second mile came from? A Roman could ask a Jew to carry their backpack for a mile. And Christ was saying, if someone asks you to go with them 1 mile, go with them 2. If you think about it, that's doubly hard, not only just in the distance going, but also in the distance coming. That's a 4-mile round trip. The first one is out of obligation. The extra mile is out of love. And so there is the obligation of service. You have to give the lesson. You have to do certain things. But then there's the extra mile. That is the model service. That is what we should be. We should be going the extra mile. And he says strength is derived from the crucified cross, which loves, continues to love, and never hates. Love never fails. So he says, we're a martyr for love. Martyr, does that sound exciting to anyone? For glory in heaven, yes. But the idea of being a living martyr, he says there's the martyr of blood, but then there's the martyr of the spirit, where you give yourself completely. So he is someone who I can characterize as someone who gave himself completely to the service. And that's why whenever I find anyone who knew him, I was like, can you tell me a story? What was he like? Some of the stories I've got were from Abouna Lo'a Sidoros. Abouna Lo'a, God rest his soul, he used to serve in Torrance. And he served with Abouna Bishoy Kamel in Alexandria. He was funny. So he would do a commemoration or memorial for Abouna Bishoy Kamel on the feast before he was canonized a saint every year. So you go, he'd give a talk on the liturgy, and then there'd be breakfast. And then he would wait until most people left. And if you were willing to stay till the very end, the last few, then he would tell you like his secret personal stories, which was amazing. So the other thing, he says, a priest is a martyr. You're going to have to lose your life. You're going to have to sacrifice. It does hurt. But that's a big part of the service. And he says, the principal aim of the priest or the servant is to pray on behalf of the people. This is something I find is lacking in today's service. We're very good at ChatGPT and Googling the things we need for our lessons. How much prayer goes into our ministry? I think that's probably the most lacking thing in our service is that we don't pray enough. And he always liked this idea of the outstretched arms. If you read his books, he has meditations on the outstretched arms of Christ. But he says that's what an intercessor is. An intercessor, someone who stretches his arms out before God on behalf of his people. And if you're talking to God like this, that's a very passionate prayer. It's almost like you're pleading and begging God. How many of us are praying with outstretched arms before our Lord Jesus Christ? And the difference between a successful servant and an unsuccessful servant is prayer. Because who changes lives? Who changes lives? It's not the servant, it's God. So he believed that the power of the service comes from God himself. And so either you think you are good enough to change lives and you don't pray, I got this lesson, it's going to be like Pentecost, 3,000 souls, right? Do you believe God is in it or not? If you're not inviting him to be a part of it, then don't expect much. And he believed that the power of the service is the divine power for all services. And he says power is derived from Christ in heaven above. It's not your talents, your experience, or your knowledge. Maybe you guys have been doing second grade for 15 years. You're like, I got this. You know how to give the lesson, but are lives changing? not without divine power. And he was someone who believed in praying the Eucharist almost daily. There are a few people like that. Pope Krolos, Abouna Michael Ibrahim, Abouna Bishoy Kamel, who prayed the liturgy almost daily. I always think, did you think they were just holy just on their own? Pope Krolos, did he really need to pray the liturgy every day? Yeah, he did. The source of his power, his ability to do all these miracles, it was from God. It was a liturgy. And so he always believed the power of the service is driven by God. We have very weak services because we're doing the service based on our own powers. God uses you. He infuses the power to change lives. So I really want us to be intercessors for our kids. Now, you guys all have a list, hopefully. If not, we'll need to talk to Vivian to make sure everyone can get a list of their own kids. The ones that give you a problem, those are the ones you pray for. The ones who don't give you a problem are also the ones you pray for, that they continue to be that way. But I do think, I read a book by a pastor one time. He had a conference for pastors. And he asked the pastors, how many of you prayed for 15 minutes today? And hardly any of them raised their hand. He called it the sin of prayerlessness. Samuel said, how can I cease to pray for these people? He said it was like, how can I sin and cease to pray for them? It's called the sin of prayerlessness. Not praying is a sin, especially for servants. So we need to spend many hours with our outstretched arms and on our knees before the crucified Christ. It was undeniable, his love for the church and her saints. And I think it's so important. A lot of time we can preach about the church, but the kids will love the church the way you do. Abouna Tedros Malati wrote a book about Abouna Bishoy Kamel. And he talks about that part where he's, during the Tamgid, he's going around the church with the Shurya. They say his feet are not even touching the floor. Like he's so uplifted by the presence of the saints for all the feasts. If he could take the servants to the monastery or to a burial site, he wanted to always have the blessings of the saints, the joy of the Tamgid, and their aid in miracles. I don't know if all of you know how he passed away, but he had cancer. So he had cancer, and it must have gone to his spine because his arm was paralyzed. So he had to go to England to be treated. So he went to the hospital, and he says, I need to take the icon of St. Mary with me. So he took the icon of St. Mary with him, and he wanted to decorate it. But they didn't have any flowers. So to Sonia and Jill, she had a cardboard box that had flowers. They cut some of the flowers from the box, and he kept it. He was like so happy. Then one of the Coptic ladies visited him, and she happened to bring him flowers. He was so joyed. And so he was actually able to decorate it. That night, he did a Tamgid late into the night. The next morning, he went to go wash his face. His arm was no longer paralyzed. He felt like the saints literally are with him at all times. And they were. And he did many miracles. It's so fascinating. They were examining him. He had cancer and it spread. And so they were testing him before the surgery. And they said, there doesn't seem like there's anything there. So they actually took him into surgery and they cut him open. They couldn't find any cancer. But they said when he was under anesthesia that he was praying the liturgy from beginning to end. And he says, I'm not going to go without the icon of St. Mary. So he took the icon of St. Mary, put it under his pillow in the surgery. He's praying the liturgy. They're like, we don't know what's going on. They're like, it's a miracle. All the cancer's gone. So they closed him up. He went back to Egypt, and the cancer came back 2 years later with a vengeance. But that's how he lived his life, very close contact with the saints. Do the kids see your passion about certain saints? Are you telling the stories, okay, in the 4th century there was some... No. Do they see your joy, your excitement in talking about the saints? Do they see that you have a relationship with the saints? Are they a part of your life? Are you celebrating the feast? Are you excited about the feast of the saints? That's contagious. We want the kids to love the church, the Tamgid. And he didn't just love the saints, but he loved the church. Obviously, like I said, the liturgy. He loved the teachings of the church, and he had an incredibly deep spiritual life. Abouna Lo'a told us there was a time where he just got into baptism. He said for a period of 3 years, weddings, funerals, everywhere, he would speak about baptism. Like what? Like he was so deep into certain things. He said, so he wrote so many beautiful books on Lent. He has so many meditations. It's called The Journey of Lent, and so many amazing thoughts on the things that we do in the church. Abouna was joke. He said, like Exodus, there was a period for 6 years he was reading Exodus. He says every time I'd go visit him, I was saying, "What are you reading?" He's like, "Exodus." He's like, "Inta Malik." Like, why? He's like, "I'm reading Exodus." But he would go so deep. He didn't just barely touch the surface. The reason why he was an amazing servant is the deep spiritual life. Without a deep spiritual life, people are going to connect to God through your connection to God. If you are connected to Him, it shows and it flows through you. He loved the Bible and he loved the church. And I want us to be that example of people who not just, okay, we're going to do Lent. No, but people who are excited about Lent and they live Lent and they drink Lent. He loved the Jesus Prayer. He read several books on the Jesus Prayer. He was trying to have his... I feel, unfortunately, although we know, okay, the Jesus Prayer originated in the monasteries in Egypt, we don't talk about it enough. We say it's one of the greatest prayers, but we don't talk about it enough. But he really emphasized the Jesus Prayer in our daily lives. He did lots of vigils. He was really into praying at night and through the night. The New Year's Eve, he always did a vigil. I used to have a tape of his New Year's Eve. His prayer on that New Year's Eve was like a 15, 20-minute prayer. Unbelievable. These are the things that changed lives. These are the things, I think he was always looking for opportunities to show his love, and he would do it through these vigils. I'm going to stay up and show you how much I care. He lived a very simple material life. He was a monk pretty much, but living in the world. Him and his wife were celibate. So they were married but celibate. He found out he was going to be a priest. He's like, oh, I got to get a wife. So there was no Amazon at that time, but he's like, okay, he found Angel. They got, within a short time, they got married and they lived together a very difficult life. So he actually came to LA. And this is how simple he was. He started St. Mark's Church. And Abouna Antonius Hanin, God rest his soul, went to go visit him. And he saw Abouna heating water in a tea kettle. And then when it was done, he would go and he'd take it to the bathtub and he's pouring in the bathtub. He's like, what are you doing? He's like, you don't have hot water? He's like, yes, salam. Do you think our grandparents had hot water? Could you imagine being the priest of the church and you don't have hot water in your apartment and you're not even telling anyone? For him, that's a way of accepting the cross. Such simplicity. So he really lived a very ascetic life. He was very much into fasting, very much into praying, very much into praises, and not being materially attached to things. Probably the most remarkable thing is his relentless passion for souls. And I think this is what separates some servants from the rest. This description was one of the priests that he served with. They said they saw him as an eagle swooping down on its prey with his teaching, love, sacrifice, and pursuit. He was always seeking whom he could save. As someone, I'm going to get you. I'm going to get you, and I'm going to bring you back. And I think this is fascinating. I'll tell you, because he saw every soul precious to Christ, he saw everyone as worthy of Christ's blood. We don't just see them as some random kid or random person, and it was imperative for him. He can't let Christ's blood be dripped in vain. Every soul had a value. The problem is we don't look at our kids as souls. We look at them as kids. But if you see them as a soul that Christ died for him, that was everything. And he believed no one was beyond the reach of Christ. For those of you who are teaching junior high boys, I want you to focus on this. No one is ever beyond the reach of Christ. Everyone can be brought back. And this, I'm going to tell you a few stories. And for this, and I will very gladly spend and be spent for your souls. St. Paul says that in 2 Corinthians. This story will exemplify that. So there was this lady who was deceived by Muslims. And she was, a lot of time it's not uncommon for a Muslim to try to date a Christian female and try to get them to become Muslim. And they become very deceived and they become very brainwashed. So there was this practice in Egypt where that it's kind of like their FBI. The person would sit with the FBI and a priest could come talk to her. But sometimes they were so brainwashed, they were very rude to the priest. They would just be like, I don't want to talk to you, and start insulting them. So Abouna Bishoy Kamel heard about this young lady, and so he went to go see her. And he was trying to talk to her, but to no avail. She actually became rude and cursing, and then they were taking her out. And as she's walking out with the soldiers, he's talking, Jesus Christ loves you, He gave Himself for you, and really trying very hard, but to no avail. Then they put her in the car, they start to drive off. Remember, He's like an eagle. So what did He do? He jumped on the back of the car and held the car as it was driving away, and the car was dragging him. So she says, stop, stop. And then she got out and went with him. She said, if a priest can show this much love, how much more can God? And all of a sudden, she came back to Christ. He would go to that extent to pursue souls. You would think she's lost. She's cursing you. She's making fun of you. She's been taken away. There's another story. A father came, Abouna, help me, help me. A policeman kidnapped my daughter. A Muslim policeman kidnapped my daughter. So he found out the address. He knocks on the door. He walks inside, goes into every room, finds her, grabs her, covers her, walks her out. And he said everyone was like statues. Like, what just happened? Do you think that was a risky situation? Absolutely. He risked his life, not only on the car, but to go seek this. He would always go after people, especially those who were far. He didn't think anyone was beyond his reach. And just like the true shepherd that would go after the one, that was one of the biggest characteristics of his life. And I think that's critical for us. Are you willing to go after the kid that hasn't come for a few weeks? What if the family situation is bad? What if he seems lost or she seems lost? Sometimes women are lost too, not just the males. And are you willing to show them that example of passionate love for them and sacrifice changes lives? There are many stories like this in his life where he would stop people and say, like, he was passing, there was this one guy, this was here in LA, one guy would come to church and would always disappear before we got to talk to him. And so one day, Abouna, he raced to the door before the guy left. He says, I want to see you. And the boy started to cry. He's like, Abouna, do you remember me? And they didn't give the details. They said, I'm the one who swindled you at St. George and Sporting, and I'm so sorry. It's like, don't worry about it, forget it. And he just accepted him. But he's like, he keeps escaping. He's like, I'm going to find a way to meet him at the door before he leaves. Whatever it takes, I will go after him. This is critical in our service. You want to know how many steps it takes for a person to be lost from the church? Not many. When we don't go after them, sometimes you may never see them again. Well, you might. Sometimes, unfortunately, it's not until they're in prison, or they've had a child out of wedlock, or they're in drugs, or they're... Go after everyone. This, to me, I think is amazing. He said the ministry of individuals. He's talking about personal relationships. I think this is pretty important. He says, the impact of relational ministry often exceeds that of 100 sermons. 100 sermons? I don't know how many years it takes for you to give 100 sermons. Like, that personal relationship is better than years of lessons. Some of us have preaching ministries where we focus on the lessons. He says that individual relationship is way better than all your lessons. And I think we tend to forget that. And the pre-servants, I always tell you, what you do outside of the classroom is more important than what you do inside the classroom. Don't forget that personal relationship, especially with those carrying a cross. I love this part about him, this meditation. Who carried the cross with Christ when he fell? On the road, who was it? Simon the Cyrene, as it says right on the slide, second point. Okay, so he has this idea, this privilege of being Simon the Cyrene. Could you imagine being the one that was chosen to carry the cross with Christ and for Christ? What a beautiful thing. So he always looked for people where he could help them carry their cross, especially those who had cancer. He would visit people, cancer patients, like a person that had cancer, he would visit them every day. And some of them he would visit one cancer patient twice a day. He considered a privilege to carry the cross with someone and for someone. I don't know about you, but I don't know anyone who doesn't know someone who has cancer. Everyone knows someone who has. What a privilege it is for you to walk with them in their cross. It is a tough period, but if you can walk with them, you are becoming like Simon the Cyrene. And also, he was this way to non-Christians and all people. So there's a story on the day of his funeral. There's two policemen talking. And I don't know how they got this conversation. I think Abouna recorded it. They said 500,000 people at his funeral. And they're saying, this is really not enough to honor this man. 500,000 people. The streets were crowded. The trains were not moving. He's like, this is not enough. The other man's like, what do you mean? He's the kind of person that if you asked him to tie your shoes, he would kneel down and tie it without hesitation. What? To a Muslim? Yeah. There was another Muslim man who was weeping. He says, my daughter needed to get married and she didn't have the furniture. So he went and bought the furniture for a Muslim family so this girl could get married. He treated everyone personally with love and sacrifice. It's not love if it's exclusive. I'm only going to love certain people and not others. That's not love. Love is non-exclusive. It doesn't wait for the person to be worthy. They don't have to be deserving. It just gives. And so I think that is really one part that was really radiating from him. Now, I think everyone that served with him knew he was a visitation machine. He did so many visitations, but in the end, he said, it's not the number of the visits, but the Spirit. Our people need the Spirit. There were many stories. There was a couple that was literally on the brink of divorce, and he would go in, say a prayer, and it says, then they had mutual love as if nothing had gone. What? So I was like, what do you think was his mentality when he's going on these visits? Couples fighting, a kid is lost. What do you think is on his mind? Oh, before I ask you that question, one more story. Another young lady was being seduced by Muslims and she was leaving Christianity and totally lost. So he decided to go visit her, but not just a visit, he actually stayed with the family for days. He lived in their house for days, and she saw Christ in his life. She began to see that living with Christ is sweet. She says, I'm going to leave the desires of the flesh, and it said she dropped them. Not only that, but that she started to become a servant of those who were going on the same path as her. Those who were being seduced and being taught the lust of the flesh. She became that servant. Why? Because of that visitation. And I got the impression that his visitation, he did not leave until he accomplished a goal. Just like when Christ visited Zacchaeus, he says, salvation has come to this house. What do you think is his mentality going into that house? Tough situations. What do you think? I don't know. I'm just guessing. No thoughts? Priests can answer.
Bring him to church.
Huh?
Bring him back to Christ.
Yes. Of course. But he's like, I'm not going in that house alone. I'm taking God with me. The Pantocrator, the one who's able to do above all that we can ask or imagine. I'm going in this house with God. We've got an assignment. We've got a problem. I'm not leaving until it's taken care of. And it wasn't like he was just going there having coffee, but if his prayer could reconcile a couple, God is working in that visit. The power of a holy visit. I can call it a holy visit. Life-changing. When we go visit the kids, if we do visit the kids, but he was, like I said, a visiting machine. How many of you guys knew Abouna Malati? You remember him when he helped start St. John. I mean, he would go, he visited left one after another. I remember he just had a list of Egyptian names. He was actually calling from our house, and the person he called happened to be Muslim. It didn't matter, it was an Egyptian name, he was going to call, and he was just going to visit. Visitations was an extremely important part of their service. And so, I don't know how many of you have noticed, so if you visit the troubled kids, you want to know how to win them, you go visit them. They will be won, they will be your friends in the class, they will listen to you, believe it or not, especially if you take them a gift. It doesn't have to be a huge gift, but when you go visit a kid and he sees that you care specifically, personally for them, that changes their lives. I had this story of this one kid, he was a troubled kid. He was one of those kids that, I don't know if he had like borderline personality. He would put firecrackers in the rear ends of cats, and he was like one of those troubled kids. I got to do a visit with him, and he told me everything I wanted to know about buying and selling marijuana. Not selling, maybe buying. If you wanted a dime, I was like, what's a dime? Like, no, like it had something to do with 10, but like that was that kid. But he ended up becoming my friend because he lived not too far from me and I could bring him to church. And that changed our relationship. Instead of being the rough kid in the class, he became the kid that would listen. Just visit. It changes lives. And I think the mentality when you do the visit, he said, it's not the number of visits, it's the spirit of the visit. God, you've got a job to do. I need you to reconcile this couple. I need you to bring this person back to you, and I need your help. I can't do it alone. The cross, if you buy any book about Abouna Bishoy Kamel, the word cross is going to be like on every page. One of Archangel Michael, years ago, they translated the sayings of Abouna Bishoy Kamel called From the Fruits of Paradise. It was around when I was in college. And that became my Holy Week book. All these sayings on the cross, so incredibly beautiful. He says, divine love emanating from the cross is the force that motivates the servants to save souls. And like I said, he had a picture of a cross on the bottom. It says, for my sake. He says the cross is the highest degree of love and its deepest depth. Christ had a love for the crucifiers and sinners. The cross is a triumph over hate. He says this, a servant must live his entire life immersed in the love of the crucified one and the power of the cross. And I don't know that we think about it much. We talk about the crucified Christ on Good Friday. But for him it was a daily meditation. It was a daily interaction. He said being immersed. And so if you read St. Paul goes to the point where he says, it's no longer I who live, I have been crucified with Christ. Is there anything more? St. Paul says, I bear in my body the marks of Christ. I do everything for Christ, in Christ, through Christ, with Christ. It's all about your relationship with the crucified and resurrected Christ. Both are important. But when you see how much he did for you, there should be nothing that you won't want to do for him. So again, I think every servant should have a picture of the crucifix, cross, Christ on the cross. It doesn't have to be a crucifix, but just a picture of Christ on the cross, icon picture, but one that reminds you how much he loves you. He says, from the foot of the cross, the servant moves. So we start from the cross, entrusting the souls of those he serves to the bosom of Christ on the cross. So this soul is yours. So you bring that person, you put that person in front of the cross. A servant then returns to the base of the cross and entrusts the souls served to the outstretched arms. You're bringing the people you're serving to Jesus Christ, who stretches arms, who receives everyone, who died for them, who loved them, and wants to save them. That's your role. That's your goal. His cancer. So he had a special name for cancer, the disease of the kingdom, the disease of paradise, because it involved such suffering. And oftentimes it led to death, so oftentimes it was a pathway to paradise. He didn't pray for it, but it was what God granted him. He carried that cross with such joy. They say in his final days, he was really suffering. There were times where he'd like wanting to scream because of the pain. But he didn't deprive anyone from coming to visit him. Even in the midst, and they say his most powerful service was when he had cancer. When he was in extreme suffering and he was carrying the cross with joy. What? Because he had more joy over saving souls than how much he was suffering. And it didn't matter. I was reading the story of a young lady who wanted to marry a Jordanian Muslim, or she didn't want to marry him. But then so she brought him to Abouna Bishoy in the midst of his cancer, and he was just lying on his bed, and she would bring him, and within days he was converted to Christ and fell in love with Christ and became converted. And then again, these are some verses that I saw from St. Paul's writings that are relevant. I love this last one. We do not lose heart, even though our outward man is perishing, yet the inward man is being renewed day by day. It's the power of the inner life that strengthens your service and blesses your service. The more you are praying and with Christ, the more you will become like Him, the more your people you're serving will feel it. So these are just, do we have a little bit to tell some cool stories? These are just like, so the beauty of Abouna Bishoy Kamel, it wasn't his preaching was amazing, very powerful, very energetic. But it was just his Christ-likeness. There's the story of the boy with the orange. So he used to pass on this sidewalk every day, and there was a boy who would always throw his orange peel, spit them on Abouna as he was passing by. And Abouna could have gone the other side of the street, but he didn't. He would always stay on that side, and he'd always get it thrown on him. Well, one day the boy didn't do it. So he asked the Boab, "What's wrong?" He says, "Oh, he got sick." He's like, "What?" So he went upstairs, he visited the boy, and he says, "Oh, I'm so sorry." And he prayed for him. He says, "And I know you like oranges." So he brought him a bag of oranges. And the boy never did it again. This idea of asking for a higher salary, when he was in LA at St. Mark's, they gave him a very generous salary of $200 a month for him and his wife. I don't know what you can buy with $200 at that time, but there's almost nothing. He was about to leave. So he went to the board and he says, "This is not enough. I need $300. And the board started to who is this priest who's asking for more money? And they started to talk about him, but he wasn't doing it for himself. He was doing it for his sister who was married to Abouna Tedros Melody, who was coming to replace him. He wanted to take the shame on himself so Abouna Tedros wouldn't have to ask. Amazing. He was bearing the shame on his own. The Abouna Lo'a story, he told us one time, him and Abouna Bishoy Kamel were walking on the street together, and then a group of youth came and beat them up. So Abouna Lo'a, next day, he went to the police station. He went to tell the sheriff, and the sheriff said, "Abouna Bishoy Kamel, he's a good man, isn't he?" Abouna Lo'a was like, "Yeah, he's a good man." He's like, "No, he's a great man, because he was here before you telling us what happened." He said, "Those are our kids. They were just playing. Nothing happened." Abouna Lo'a felt a little bit embarrassed. But he was covering and forgiving the people that were attacking him. What? They were probably not Christians. They were probably Muslims, and he was just forgiving and loving, covering up the sins of others. The trip to the monastery is just like a cool thing. So one of the people he converted obviously was a Muslim, and the Muslim became so in love with Christ, he joined the monastery. So after joining the monastery, a few weeks later, Abouna Bishoy was driving to the monastery to go visit him. And then he came to this very isolated part of the desert, and there was this Bedouin just standing there looking for a ride. So, of course, he stops and he takes him in, and he's driving. He's like, "Do you want me to take you?" He's like, No. Right here is fine." So he stops, he goes around, he lets him out, he opens the door, grabs his arm, and he sees that it's pierced with a nail. And then he disappears. Then a few days later, the brothers of the monk who were Muslim came to him weeping, saying, "Abouna, we were waiting for you on that road to the monastery. We were waiting to kill you. When we saw that you had a passenger with you, we decided not to." So Jesus Christ happened to appear just to save his life, for saving the soul of another one. So sometimes when I go visit someone after someone passed away in their family, I tell them Baba is still Baba, or Mom is still Mom. There's a story of Tasoni Angel after Abouna passed away. She went to go park her car in a structure, but she didn't have the money to pay the valet. She's like, "I'm going to go visit someone. I'll be back, and I'll pay you." So she went, she did the visit, she came back, and she went to give the man. He's like, No, it's okay. It's already taken care of. She's like, "What do you mean?" He's like, "Your man paid." She's like, "What? Your man, he wears black? He came and he paid on your behalf. Your car is taken." What? He was taking care of his wife after he passed away. I think it's no coincidence that he passed on the third day of the Feast of the Cross, which is March 21st, which is this Friday, because his preaching and his teachings about the cross were his life. And in the final days, he's lying on his bed, he says, "What is this opening up in the ceiling?" And he saw like the heavens ready to receive him, and that's how he went. I cannot summarize all of Abouna Bishoy Kamel in one talk, but I hope you got a bit of his spirit. He was a soul chaser, he was a loving person, he was the image of Christ. I pray that our souls, our service will be empowered by God through prayer, and that we would be the ones that are chasing souls, and that no one should ever be lost from this church because we didn't try hard enough. I pray for his blessings upon us all and his intercessions. In Jesus' name, amen.